A horse-drawn carriage rolled slowly across the dust-choked desert. Inside the corpse of the most powerful man in the ancient world was rotting the stench so unbearable they had to stuff the carriage with dead fish just to mask it. No, this is not a horror movie. This is the final chapter of the man who once turned all of China into his personal backyard. A man who not only unified a nation, but tried to control the very way you think, measure right, and even remember the past. His name was Qin Shi Huang, and his story is not just a history lesson. It is an operating system upgrade for an entire civilization. Before we dive into a tale steeped in the smell of burnt books, soldiers' sweat, and the chilling silence of scholars buried alive, if you are someone who finds yourself drawn to the deep forgotten mysteries of the past, go ahead and hit subscribe and leave us a comment telling us where you are listening from. Because this story is not just about how one man seized power. It is about how he redefined power itself, with the sword, with the law, with terracotta statues, and with fear. And trust me, after this, you will never look at a map of China the same way again. The beginning and the big question. How did a 13-year-old boy become the one who unified all of China? When Yingzheng was just 13 years old, the state of Qin was merely one of 7 wild and unruly cowboys in China's warring states period. Each of these kingdoms thought it was the center of the universe. Each had its own soldiers, plots, backstabbing court intrigue, and the overconfidence that always seems to follow a few too many cups of wine. But Yingzheng was not just a teenage prime minister. He was a symbol, born to shoulder an enormous dream. He did not choose to dream small. He chose unification. And that raises a question so profound, it makes you want to pause this video, take a breath, and listen carefully. How did a teenager who had just lost his father, who stood alone on the throne while kings, nobles, and political factions all wanted to snuff out his power, become the one who unified the entirety of China? Because China was not always China. There were regions crying for independence, militias being trained troops stationed at borders, and aristocrats partying inside their palaces, a shattered mess of political pieces. The 7 great states, Qinzhou, Weichu, Hanyan, and Qi, saw each other like enemies on a borderland version of Tinder, promising alliances one day and betraying each other the next. Armies moved across farmlands. The air was filled with the stench of battle, the crackle of fire, the clash of swords, and the cries of the fallen. There were no standardized laws, no common script, no roads that linked the kingdoms together. There was money, there were fields, warriors, schemes, but no nation. Yingzheng was born in the year 259 before the Common Era, into the house of Ying, the royal family of the Qin state. When he ascended the throne, yes, at just 13 years old, his parents were already gone, and the real power lay in the hands of ministers and those who held the reins behind the scenes. This boy king had a crown on his head and a long list of enemies who wanted to end the game of power by removing him entirely. Alone in the palace, Yingzheng was raised under pressure. From that very moment, every action he took, every decision he made had to answer one question. If he made even a single wrong move, would his life and his throne vanish like sea foam swallowed by mud? But this teenager was not just a dumping ground for aristocratic schemes. He soon learned about Xiangyang, the great reformer, a true legalist. A man whom later historians would say, without Xiangyang, Qin would never have become strong enough to defeat the other states. Xiangyang brought changes that seemed cruel, but those very reforms made ordinary people see Qin as a state that could both take lives and keep the roads clean with laws that were clear and enforced. Land ownership, taxes, the military, everything was reorganized. The power of the nobility was reduced, and state law was placed above bloodline. The young man on the throne began to understand to unify China, it would take more than swords and spears, it would take systems, laws, and fear. And then he began to force the history books to rewrite what power looked like. Not through grand performances, but through building the foundation from within. Internal reforms, recruiting the right people, law-making, administrative systems, everything had to be tightened, refined, sharpened, so that when war finally came, Qin would be the blade, cutting through the chaos. In the shadows of the palace, Yingzheng spoke little to those around him. But in every smallest decision, in every courtly reception, in the way he gazed through the window over a city of high walls, he already saw what others did not. This land needed someone stronger, strong enough to silence the endless cries of conflict. And the day he officially declared himself emperor was the day the dream of regional warlords began to die. But how did he achieve what seemed impossible? We are going to turn every page of this story, the internal reforms, the victories on the battlefield, the standardization of culture and law, the construction of symbols of power, the suppression of intellectuals, the expansion of borders, and finally the answer that emerges when all the pieces come together. This is how Qin Shi Huang unified China. So are you ready? As the dark curtain of the Qin dynasty begins to rise, there stands a 13-year-old boy, and in his eyes is an empire yet to be born. Let us uncover how Yingzheng combined ambition, law, and ruthless force to make 6 kingdoms kneel, not out of love, not out of belief, but out of sheer recognition that only he could hold that power forever. From within, how Qin reshaped the battlefield with laws and reforms before drawing the sword. Want to unify the world first, you must unify your own house. And Qin Shi Huang, still the young Yingzheng at the time, inherited a weapon far sharper than any sword or spear, the law tool that in the right hands could turn a mere child into the reason 6 kingdoms trembled like students being called on during a surprise test. To understand just how powerful Qin had become, we need to rewind about a century before Zheng's rise. That is where we meet a man named Shang Yang, hated by nobles, feared by peasants, and reluctantly acknowledged by historians as a dark genius. In an era where power was handed out based on bloodline and laws were written with emotion, Shang Yang arrived like a warring states version of Steve Jobs. I do not care if you are noble. Can you get the job done? No, get out. Shang Yang introduced legalist reforms, a philosophy as cold as ice, yet as precise as a Swiss watch. In this system, people did not need morality. They just needed to obey. Everything, land ownership, taxation, the military was restructured. Nobles no longer enjoyed tax exemptions. Feudal generals could no longer do as they pleased. From now on, whoever killed the most enemies with receipts, with proof, got promoted and rewarded. Did not kill, stay put, and face punishment. Anyone who reported corruption was rewarded. Anyone who covered it up was punished more harshly than the criminal himself. This system was brutal, but it was exactly what transformed Qin from a weak, isolated Western state into the nightmare of the East. In the shadow of these reforms, a new generation was born. No nobility, no bloodline advantage, only merit. And in that world, Yingzheng came of age. He learned that power does not need people to love you. It only needs them to fear hating you. By the time Zheng took power, Shang Yang's legacy was still in motion, but it was not enough. Zheng needed a formation sharper, faster, and loyal to only one person himself. That was when he turned to Li Si, a legalist scholar from the state of Chu with the eyes of a fortune teller and a mind as cold as stone. Li Si understood one thing clearly. If you want to unify China, you must first unify the way people think. And thought could only be bent if the law was the vice. Li Si and Zheng began what would become their second great reform, This time it was not just about farmers or the military, it was the entire administrative system. They redrew the map, dividing the empire into districts and counties. Officials were no longer appointed based on bloodline, but strictly by administrative performance in every sense ancient China's version of key performance indicators. Those who performed well were promoted. If someone lost an ox in the village, fired. Superiors were responsible for monitoring their subordinates. Subordinates reported directly to the central government. Everything functioned like a machine, and Zheng was its central gear. And what about the old nobility? Their power was stripped away slowly, like pulling out fingernails one by one. First, their land was taken. Then their command over soldiers was removed. And finally, many of them were reduced to nothing more than a name in a dusty family registry, harmless and silent like a tiger with all its fangs ripped out. But true power did not lie in the administrative structure alone. It lay in information. And Zheng knew this well. If every state had its own writing system, its own method of measuring length, its own currency, China would never be united. So he and Li Si standardized everything. Writing became unified. There was now a standard unit of length, a standard model for weight. Currency the same shape, the same value, and even the same sound when it hit the ground. Anyone still using the old ways was seen as defying the empire. And defying the empire, no one needed to explain the consequences. From that point on, Qin became something strange and formidable. No one cared who the emperor loved or whom he shared his bed with, only that when a command came from above, it had to be obeyed. No hesitation. No debate. This was an empire built on law, not on loyalty. And that was exactly what made the other kingdoms start to tremble. While states like Chuyan and Qi were still tangled in family affairs, in questions of lineage and who marries whom to secure political alliances, Qin had already completed its administrative system, military structure, legal codes, and logistics network. A machine powered by fear and reward, by control and efficiency, by an emotionless rule of law. And at the heart of it all stood a man who did not sleep well at night, because he knew that to hold on to power, there could not be a single day of relaxation. Yingzheng had understood that since he was 13 years old. Now he was laying the groundwork for the greatest military offensive in ancient Chinese history. But before launching his campaign, he had to make sure that when he stepped out of the capital, no one behind him would dare betray him. A unified nation cannot be forged through war alone. It must be cast from within, from every line of law, every grain of rice in the granaries, every beat of the bureaucratic drum that echoed daily without fail. And once everything was secure on the inside, Yingzheng would finally unleash his fury upon the outside world. Blood would spill, cities would fall, and the 6 kingdoms would dissolve like salt in boiling water. But first, let us be clear, Qin did not unify China by force alone. It was unified by the most powerful political operating system the ancient world had ever seen, and law was the virus embedded into the minds of every subject. Welcome to the empire. The program has begun to run. From now on, all resistance will be treated as a bug. Blood and motion. When swords and fortresses spoke. Once the inner structure was stable like a law printing machine, once every stone in the palace corridor reflected the emperor's gaze, the next thing Qin Shi Huang needed was not persuasion, it was execution, and not of individuals, but of entire nations. Starting in the year 230 before the Common Era, the game left the realm of palace intellect and entered a new era, a dance of blood smoke and metal. On that stage, Qin did not make an entrance with greetings. It arrived with armies thick as thunderclouds, boots pounding like storm roll, and a slogan sharp and simple: submit or vanish. The campaign began with Han, the weakest of the 7 major states. A test strike, and like every horror film opening, the first victim always dies fast, clean, and brutally, just to send a message. Han was wiped off the map in less than a year. Qin did not just seize land, it eliminated remaining forces, forcibly removed the ruling class, and turned Han into a testing ground for a beta version of unified China. The other kingdoms, instead of joining forces, fell into history's oldest trap: distrust. Qin, using the strategy of horizontal alliances, befriend the distant strike. The nearby succeeded in getting the eastern states to draw their own death maps. Qin's diplomats moved like wind, offered gifts like it was Thanksgiving, and spread fear like Halloween on an endless loop. If you do not strike Chu first, Chu will join us and strike you. And so everyone fought each other while Qin sat back and counted the bodies. But the real triumph, the gut punch to history, came from the north, the Battle of Changping in 260 before the Common Era. The opponent was Zhao, a militarily strong state proud with disciplined troops and capable generals. The two sides clashed in a war that lasted 3 years. Yes, 3 years. The soil could no longer grow crops. Rabbits fled afraid of stray arrows. Rain stopped falling. Only arrows rained down. General Bai Qi of Qin, a name that still frightens some to this day, chose a strategy of leave them no path to live. After luring Zhao's army into a trap, he ordered a full encirclement, cut off their supplies, blocked their water, and slowly tightened the noose like a massive python. When the Zhao army finally surrendered, they were not spared. Bai Qi ordered the execution of over 400,000 prisoners, not out of hatred, but because of logistics. Keeping that many alive meant feeding them. And once again, war under the Qin was not just about territory. It was psychological warfare, terror delivered straight to the nervous system of every enemy. When news of the massacre spread, people in neighboring states began to whisper, "If we lose, will any of us even be buried?" After Zhao came Wei, then Chu, once powerful states, now reduced to scattered bricks, pressed into the foundation of the Qin Empire. But each battle was its own variation. Wei fell quickly, fast in, fast out. Chu, on the other hand, was stubborn. It dragged on, resisted, refused to die, forcing Qin to learn a new lesson. Swords alone were not enough. You had to strike the mind, too. So they began sending letters, not letters of sentiment, but of ultimatum: surrender, and your name remains on the map. Resist and leave behind your land, your people, and your memory. The state of Yawn panicked so badly, it sent an assassin to kill Qin Shi Huang. The attempt failed, but it left behind a bitter truth in history. When the Qin emperor is angry, blood flows without need for a reason. Yawn was destroyed not long after, a kingdom erased for the mistake of sending an assassin who was not even skilled enough. And finally, there was Qi, the last one standing. They did not fight. They did not send assassins. They did not resist. They surrendered with the weight of a deep, heavy bow to a rising empire. Without a drop of blood, Qin entered Qi like an investor acquiring a startup. Total buyout, name change, board of directors dismissed, and operations now ran as Qin wished. By the year 221 before the Common Era, China was unified for the first time under a centralized state. No more internal borders. No more regional kings. Only one emperor and a new name: Qin Shi Huang. But make no mistake, this was not the tale of a hero saving the world. It was the result of precision, of legalist philosophy, with no tolerance, of an army trained with fear and discipline. A victory forged by strict law on the inside and bloodied swords on the outside. An empire built on bones, yet running with the precision of a clock. The question is, once the killing was done, once unification was complete, what would Qin Shi Huang do next? Retire? No. He built palaces, raised walls, drew maps for the future, and began rewriting what China meant from the roots up. But that is a story for another time. For now, sit with this truth. No one in the history of China, or even the world, has ever unified such a vast land so quickly, so ruthlessly, and so effectively that the survivors no longer even dared to imagine rebellion. Qin did not just conquer kingdoms. They conquered the very idea that China should remain many kingdoms. And from the ashes of Zhao Hanwei, Yanqi, and Chu, something new emerged, a single nation, with one writing system, one unit of measurement, one code of law, and one man, who would never again let anyone call him king, call him emperor, the first. And if you think this part was terrifying, wait until you see what happens when he starts to standardize how people write, speak, think, and even remember in the next part. An empire born through imprints, writing coins, roads, and measurement laws. Killing people can get you territory. But if you want to keep it, you have to rewrite the world they live in. And that was the moment when Qin Shi Huang stopped being a military strategist. He became a full-scale social programmer. Just because the rival states had been erased from the map did not mean the work was done. Unification by the sword was only temporary. True unification required something unprecedented, making the people of the North write in the same script as those in the South, making mountain dwellers and lowland farmers use the same coin, making cartwheels roll from west to east without getting stuck in turns because the axle lengths were different. And so Qin Shi Huang began the second phase of his unification, smashing physical aesthetic and cultural differences, then recasting the entire idea of China. Made in Qin. First came the writing. Imagine living in Chu, where characters looked like paintings, every written letter a surrealist artwork. Now an order from the central government arrives. Use Qin's script. Not a suggestion, a command. The voice in your head was no longer written in your ancestors' symbols, but in a simplified, sharper, more angular system called small seal script. Beautiful, precise uniform like the logo of a global corporation. Those who disobeyed their writing would be erased from signs, from documents, from collective memory. To write differently was to break the law. And under the Qin, breaking the law did not mean a late tax notice, it meant real punishment. Real blood. Next came currency. Each former kingdom had its own type of money, unique shapes, unique ratios, and all of them became worthless. Qin Shi Huang launched a new standard currency, round coins, with square holes symbolizing heaven is round, earth is square, and also practical for stringing onto cords. These coins were not just a medium of exchange, they were a geometric declaration of central authority. Use the old coins, and it was like trying to pay with counterfeit dollars in New York. You could not trade, could not pay taxes, could not live like a citizen anymore. Then came the measurement system. A bitter ancient truth: if every region measured rice differently, merchants became sorcerers. Sell one sack of grain in Zhao, carry it to Wei, and suddenly that same sack turned into two, or disappeared by half, depending on the rules. Qin said enough. Weight, length, volume, all were standardized. Measuring incorrectly was fraud, and fraud was a crime. Today we use the international system of units. But in 221 before the Common Era, Qin had its own version, not for flexibility, but for domination. At this point you might be thinking, was he obsessed with control? Qin was not obsessed with control. Qin was control. And to control effectively, you needed roads for troops to march, grain to move, and orders to spread. So, The roads began to rise, not trails, but highways in the truest ancient sense. Straight as a ruler, wide enough for two horse-drawn carriages to pass side by side, paved with stone linking every county and district back to the capital of Xianyang like arteries feeding the heart. Even axle width was standardized, not because of engineering, but because the emperor hated seeing wheels get stuck when crossing from one district to another due to different axle systems. But roads were not just for carts. They were for soldiers. Patrol troops, riot squads, and suppressors of rebellion. With roads, the Central Army could reach the borders in a matter of days. With roads, the emperor could send commands to the farthest corners of the empire without waiting on pigeons. And more than anything, with roads, the central government could appear at any moment like a phantom of power hovering above the people's heads. And once the physical systems were standardized, Qin turned to the human system. The newly conquered territory was divided into more than 36 commanderies, each further divided into counties. Each level had an official appointed directly by the emperor. No more regional kings. No more local nobility. Officials were now government employees. They could not pass their titles to their children. They were judged strictly on performance. Think provincial department manager, but instead of being reassigned for mistakes, they were beheaded. A formal, streamlined, orderly state was forged, like the technical blueprint of an empire. There was no room for randomness. Every character, every coin, every step on the stone roads, all were data running through the Qin operating system. And Qin Shi Huang was no different from a supreme system administrator, seated at the center, observing through the eyes of his officials, issuing commands in standardized script, calculating grain production through uniform measurements, tracking how much rice each season would yield. Some say Qin was obsessed with control, but that is a postmodern mindset. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, control meant survival. Every former kingdom was watching, waiting for the chance to rebel. Every conquered people dreamed of independence. And in those dreams, even a single flaw in the system could be enough to bring the entire empire crashing down like a row of dominoes. So he allowed no flaws. Both tools and people had to be standardized. And if you wanted to live in peace, you had to live the way Qin had defined it. In 221 before the Common Era, for the first time, China did not just share one ruler. It shared one script, one currency, one axle width. And if you think that sounds dull, remember that is the very foundation that allowed a civilization to survive for over 2,000 years, no matter how many empires rose and fell. Unification through war was just the prologue. True unification, through writing, through measurement, through wheels, that was the part no one dared to speak of with scorn. Qin did not just rule people. They ruled the very logic of life. And in the end, no one said people of Zhao or money of Chu. They said only one thing. We are the people of the emperor. Are you ready for the next chapter where Qin did not just control the present, but began building the future? A future of bricks, stone, blood, and eternity. Walls, palaces, and glorious graves. The public relations of power. An emperor had unified the world beneath heaven. A man who rose from a silent boy in the palace of Xianyang to the one who stood atop the corpses of kingdoms. But power does not end with victory. It must be raised, cast in stone, carved into the earth, and if necessary, buried beneath it, along with tens of thousands of the dead, so that no one ever forgets who truly owns this world. And that was when Qin Shi Huang began building monuments, not to live in, but to live forever. Not to block out sun or rain, but to make men shiver even in the heat of summer. Epang, a name that sounds like a poem from antiquity, but was in truth the title of a dream, overflowing with megalomania. The Epang Palace was drawn on paper, as a structure not meant for mortals. Its planned footprint was larger than anything Asia had ever seen. Its corridors stretched as if to walk from the Xia dynasty to the Zhou. Its vaulted ceilings were as high as the emperor's ego, and according to legend, he wished to gaze from its heights and see all the land he had conquered, a living three-dimensional map, where he could point to any mountain, any river, and command it to move. Epang was never completed, perhaps because it was never meant to be. It was a symbol built to exist in eternal progress, a project not to be lived in, but to ensure no one ever stopped looking at it. A construction that declared, "I am not like the kings before me. I build for the future, not for the now." But if Epang was a monument that reached toward the heavens, then the Great Wall was the stone serpent that wrapped itself around the spine of China. Do not imagine the Qin version of the wall as the picture-perfect tourist spot you take selfies with today. It was not a flawless line of neatly stacked bricks. It was a brutal patchwork of ancient ramparts, stitched together by blood sweat and the sinews of laborers, many of whom never returned. Its purpose was not just to keep invaders out. It was to remind those within that the emperor held everything so tightly. Even the borders obeyed. The Qin Wall may not have stopped every enemy, but it did make one thing clear: wherever there was a wall, there were the eyes of the empire. And wherever there were eyes, thoughts of betrayal were not allowed to form. But even these mighty constructions, as awe-inspiring as they were just the warm-up for the final masterpiece. A project that no one could live in, but everyone had to know about: the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang. They say that when he ascended the throne, he immediately ordered the construction of his tomb, meaning that throughout his entire career, he was not only building a nation, he was also building his own death. Not because he was obsessed with immortality, but because he wanted to control even the impossible legacy. The mausoleum lies underground, buried so deep that no one knows exactly what lies within. What we do know comes only from what has been excavated around it, and just that outside part alone is enough to make every emperor who came after feel like they were building chicken coops. The terracotta army was not decoration. It was a garrison, an immortal force forged from earth, standing in formation, dressed in armor, holding weapons, each face uniquely sculpted. Thousands of statues, and not one identical to another. As if every soldier who had once lived, fought, and died for the emperor had now been reborn in clay to keep serving him even in death. If war was a dance of blood, this was the silent symphony of power. A man who had unified the living world was not about to let go of the dead one. He did not believe in reincarnation or rebirth. He believed in control down to the final grain of soil that would fall upon his coffin. Rumors spoke of rivers of mercury ceilings inlaid with precious gems and automated defense systems, things beyond the imagination of his time. And though no one has dared to fully excavate the tomb for reasons of preservation and perhaps fear of a curse, the world still knows, buried beneath the earth, lies the essence of a man who never did anything. Halfway. Qin Shi Huang did not build a tomb. He built an underground world. A world where every brick seems to whisper, "I was the first to unify China. And I will remain here to make sure no one forgets it." All of these structures, the palace, the wall, the mausoleum, were never just about material. They were political marketing at its most absolute. In an age without newspapers, without television, without TikTok, Qin Shi Huang broadcast his message through architecture. A message without subtitles, without narration, just size, scale, and an overwhelming silence: "I am the emperor, and this world was cast in my image." You can kill a man with a sword, but you make an entire generation submit with statues. And if statues become men, then men become eternal. Qin did not just bury the bodies of his enemies. He buried the very possibility of rebellion for generations to come. Because how do you even dare to revolt when every fortress you pass still echoes with the power of a man who died over 2,000 years ago? And if you still think all of this was just one man's obsession, remember this. It was thanks to those structures, those standards, those reforms, that China became a real, lasting concept. Even as later dynasties rose and fell, even through chaos and civil war, even with name changes and power shifts, the idea of a unified nation with central authority, law territory, and sovereign power endured. And the first person who dared to believe that such a thing was possible was not a poet, was not a philosopher. He was a builder with a dream carved into stone that echoed even in death. So if you are sitting there now, shivering at the thought of a mercury-filled tomb, whispering to yourself, "This guy was insane but genius," then welcome. You have officially fallen into this bloody, fascinating maze of history. And if you have made it this far and still have not hit subscribe, that might be dangerous. Not for us, but for you. Are you sure you will find this channel again, buried among thousands of algorithmic distractions? Subscribing not only gets you ready for the next part. Yes, the book burning is coming. It also tells the algorithm that you want more of this kind of history. Salty like fish sauce and philosophical too. Like this, drop a comment. Got questions? Throw them in. We will handle them. History is not just for remembering, it is for retelling the right way. Ready for what comes next. Because after building the symbols, he began erasing the ideas. And yes, this is where the books burn, the scholars die, and silence starts speaking louder than ever. Silence or be silenced, when words and ideas became the enemy. Do you think an empire like Qin ruled only with swords and stone? Think again. Qin Shi Huang did not just build walls to block invaders' palaces to project power or tombs to flaunt legacy. He did something that few have ever dared to do, not just in Chinese history, but in the history of all empires. He burned everything that did not fit his ideological system. And if that sends a chill down your spine, good. This is not the part where we joke anymore. Because after unifying the land, the script, the measurements, the currency, and the territory, there was still one thing left to clean up thought. And no one stood more directly in the emperor's path than those who could read. In a world where power had always been physical, swords, cities, soldiers, land knowledge was a kind of invisible dynamite. An old Confucian book could make villagers question new laws. A line of poetry praising a former king could spark nostalgia, then rebellion. A teacher telling stories of the good old days of Chu was not just a historian, he was a ticking time bomb. And Qin Shi Huang, with the eyes of a system administrator, suffering from post-virus paranoia, decided the entire old operating system of thought, wipe it clean. The order was given: any book not about agriculture, medicine, divination, or engineering, burn it. And we are not talking about a few books. Entire stacks, entire storerooms, entire libraries. It did not matter when it was written, or whether the author was a genius. If it did not serve power, it was garbage. The night those first flames licked the pages, Qin did not just burn books. He burned the right to remember. In a time before Google, before photocopiers, before cloud storage books were society's memory, burning them was not psychological manipulation. It was national brain surgery. But if you think it stopped with the books, you still underestimate the reach of this empire. Those who disobeyed, who kept forbidden books, or worse, who still remembered what was inside them, were taken. Not for re-education, but for burial. Ancient records tell of the execution of 460 Confucian scholars, men who dared to criticize the regime or simply refused to stay silent. Later, historians debated whether the number was accurate. But the number is not the point. The fear was. What happens when those who can read, who understand ethics, who study morality, are treated like enemies of the state? The answer: people start to shut their mouths. From that moment on, no one dared teach children with stories of the past. No one dared say long ago a Han king was also a wise ruler. No one dared write poetry without state-approved themes. Thought was shackled by law, and the law was written by men who feared the written word. Qin Shi Huang did not fear the poor. The poor knew only how to plow, eat rice, and pay taxes. What he feared were those capable of imagining a society different from the one he had built. He feared those who could turn writing into rebellion, who could turn knowledge into a torch aimed at the throne. And so, like an antivirus installed directly into the brain, Qin did not just purge malware, he deleted every good application that had not yet been updated. Everything was swept into the recycle bin, and that recycle bin was never opened again. This was the era of silence. No debate, no dissent, no more open dialogues like in the time of the 100 schools of thought. Only one stream of ideology remained the law of the empire. Those who strayed from it were swept away. Those who stood still had to bow their heads. The most terrifying part: no one found it terrifying anymore. A society that no longer remembers freedom of speech does not know what it has lost. A generation of children taught only one curriculum begins to believe there is only one way to live. And in that silence, the emperor's power was no longer coercion, it became truth. No one had enough information left to even begin to question. And so China entered a kind of spiritual freeze. The cold did not come from the northern winds, it came from knowing too much and still saying too little. Fear of being overheard, fear of being questioned, fear of being remembered. A society where even questions required permission. You think the empire would fall to a military rebellion? Number wars of steel often give birth to new regimes. But when the soul of a nation has been reset, that death is permanent. Qin Shi Huang did not just build an empire out of stone. He built it from the empty spaces between words and from the fear of not being allowed to fill them. But history has a memory of its own, and through all his cruelty, Qin Shi Huang's name survived, not because of how many he killed, but because he reached the deepest level of control, the domination of memory. The question is, after burning the books, burying the scholars, erasing memories, and sealing thought, did he finally feel safe? The answer lies in the next chapter. Because to silence every fear, he began expanding the borders. Not to conquer, but to outrun the very ghosts he had created. Not just within fear was not yet big enough. By now he had unified the nation, burned every book, executed the scholars, and built palaces as if gods themselves were about to move in. Any ordinary ruler would have stopped there. But Qin Shi Huang was no ordinary ruler. And when you have managed to control everything from the turning of wheels to the thoughts of your people, there is only one thing left that can keep you awake at night. The idea that somewhere out there, something still does not belong to you. Welcome to the age of border expansion. Not for land, not for resources, not even for trade, but for fear. Not fear of the outside world, fear of emptiness. Because once you own everything, every empty space becomes a threat. And the borders, those distant, faintly drawn edges on the map, became the reason Qin Shi Huang could not sleep. He did not see frontiers. He saw open doors to danger. And how did he deal with them? He locked them shut with blood and stone. The Northern Campaign began with a name that still furrows the brows of every history student, the Xiongnu. Nomadic tribes that rode like the wind, struck like hail, and vanished like mist. No empire ever truly owned them because they had no interest in being owned. But to Qin Shi Huang, that was unacceptable. A land with people but no government, that was a system error. And he never let errors live. Qin's army surged north like a storm front, not to destroy the Jiangnu, because you cannot destroy what never stands still. The goal was to push them farther, drive them higher, scatter them beyond the reach of imperial order. And in the places they had once called home, he built fortresses, camps, watchtowers, and chained them together into what would become the earliest foundation of what we now call the Great Wall of China. But the wall was only the surface. Beneath it lay a new network of control garrisons, checkpoints, magistrates, registries, ledgers. Every citizen relocated, every tribe divided, every territory assigned a code. This is how Qin turned the borderlands into internal lands. And it is also how he began to sleep a little easier, knowing that beyond the mountain was no longer an unknown. Not just the north. The south became a battleground too. There lived the Baiyu tribes with different languages, customs, and ways of life. And unsurprisingly, different attitudes about the emperor. To Qin Shi Huang, they were not foreigners. They were the unenlightened. And back then, enlightenment meant this: add them to the tax rolls, force them to use Qin script, measure their fields with Qin rulers, and extract tribute from their harvests. The army surged into the south like a flood of forced civilization. Roads and bridges were built. Qin settlers were moved in, and those who resisted were handled administratively. A whole humid tropical region began to echo with the voice of empire, not through doctrine, but through marching boots and tax collections. The deep jungle was no longer a refuge. It was now surveyed, marked, and mapped. And yet, strangely, the farther he went, the more Qin Shi Huang seemed to lose his sense of direction. Every new territory conquered, every road constructed, every watchtower raised, only made him want more. Not out of greed, but out of emptiness. When you have mastered everything within, wiped out all opposition, deleted history, there is nothing left to reflect yourself against. No one dares to say you are wrong. No one dares to write there was once another king. And when nothing remains to oppose you, power is no longer power. It becomes a quiet room where only one voice echoes your own. And to fill that void, he kept going, pushing the borders. Not to build a country, but to avoid looking inward. Some historians believe that in his final years, Qin Shi Huang no longer cared for governance. He became obsessed with immortality. He began to search for the elixir of life. He sent envoys to the ends of the earth, searching for sages, godly islands, mystical pills. The man who had crushed every school of thought now wandered into the maze of eternal life, like a startup founder burning money on artificial intelligence, just to forget that he could not control death. That was the final frontier. There were no more kingdoms left to conquer. Only time itself to defeat. And in his inspection, tours across the empire, Qin Shi Huang was not just checking the land, he was checking for signs of death. Gazing at cities, roads, mountains to make sure he was still on them, within them, part of them. He died on one of those journeys. Among mobile palaces surrounded by hundreds of guards beside unopened boxes of elixirs he never drank. He died as a secret. His entourage kept the news hidden, terrified that if the people found out, the entire system would collapse like dominoes. Qin Shi Huang conquered everything except himself. And after he died, the empire began to crack. Not because of outside attacks, but because no one inside remained who could maintain what he had tried to hold together with his entire life: fear. The final chapter will show you how this empire ended and reveal the true answer to the question: How did Qin Shi Huang unify China? Spoiler, he succeeded. But the cost may have been the soul of the nation itself. The answer: unification through blood law, memory, and fear. Qin Shi Huang died in a sealed carriage under the burning summer sun of the desert, his body decomposing so badly that his entourage had to mask the smell by packing the coach with dead fish. A death with no glory, no drums, no fanfare, no immortal hymns. The man who once buried an entire army underground to guard his eternal slumber died in silence, in secrecy, embalmed in the fear of his own servants. And you know what? That death is the perfect answer to the question we asked from the very beginning. How did Qin Shi Huang unify China? He did it not with kindness, not with eloquence. He did not negotiate. He did not persuade. He was not a cultural icon, not a poet, not a sage. He was a system, a machine programmed to unify and delete anything that did not fit into the idea of one. One nation, one script, one measurement, one currency, one center of power. One man standing above all. And to achieve that, he did what no one else had dared to do in the entire history of ancient China. He forced everything into a single format and cut down anything that exceeded the frame. When he began, China was a scattered collection of states with different cultures, different laws, different scripts, like a crowd of people lost in an IMAX theater, each wearing a different color of 3D glasses. He tore off every pair, smashed every lens, and handed out a new set uniform clear and impossible to remove. And strangely enough, it worked. From the wide roads that link the provinces to the writing system that still forms the base of modern Chinese characters, from standardized units of measurement to the division of land into centrally governed administrative districts, it all began with Qin. The things we take for granted in modern society, like having a single legal code across the country, or knowing that your coin will be accepted in any province, are the legacy of one man obsessed with unity to the point that he turned it into his personal religion. But at the same time, let us be clear, this unification did not come through consensus. It came through coercion. There were no conferences, no compromises. There were book burnings. There were buried scholars. There was the erasure of every dissenting voice. While other nations sought peace through agreement, Qin established order by eliminating resistance. It was like running an operating system that refused to let anyone install third-party applications. Anything outside the empire's app store was deleted, frozen, blacklisted. And the system architect Qin Shi Huang did not just lock the system. He removed the reset button entirely. That is why when he died, everything began to collapse. Not because it was weak, but because no one else knew how to run it. His son Hu Hai came to power through a web of lies manipulated like a puppet by Zhao Gao, a eunuch more powerful than the emperor himself. And soon after, the Qin Empire, which had once seemed solid as granite, began to shatter like glass beneath the screams of peasants. Rebellions broke out. The people no longer feared. Those who had once been silenced now wept, then roared. The books were gone, but memory lived on, passed through stories, through tears, through hunger. And just 15 years after the day China was unified, the Qin Empire fell. But here's the strange and terrifying truth: even in its fall, it left behind a definition. Qin failed as a dynasty, but it succeeded as a prototype. The Han dynasty adopted Qin's administrative structure. Dynasties that followed, though they condemned Qin as tyrannical, still used its measurements, its tax system, its county divisions, all inherited from the man they once denounced. Like users who complain a software is too restrictive, but still reopen it every day. Qin Shi Huang unified China not just through war. He did it by making it impossible for people to imagine any other way to exist outside the system he had built. And that is a kind of domination even more frightening than military conquest, because it embeds itself in the DNA of society. So when we ask, how did he unify China, the answer cannot be neat. Because he did not do it with just one tool. He used them all. The sword to conquer, the law to stabilize, writing to control thought, currency to standardize trade, roads to regulate speed, architecture to intimidate, the tomb to immortalize, and finally, fear to maintain order. Qin Shi Huang was not simply a tyrant. He was the prototype of absolute power, the first and fiercest trial version of the classical totalitarian state. And whether you admire or despise him, you cannot deny one truth: he laid the foundation for what we now call China. He left behind no music. No book of philosophy bears his name. No one even knows what his real face looked like. But he left behind the blueprint for an entire civilization. Others left statues. He left a system. And somewhere in the roads, still slicing straight through the North China Plain, in the script still carved on village gates, in the way a child learns to read, to count, to measure, he still lives. Not in the flesh, but in the format. You are still here. Then you have walked this entire journey with Qin Shi Huang, from a 13-year-old boy surrounded by betrayal to a name carved into the soul of an entire civilization. If at any point you shivered or paused to reflect, or simply could not stop listening, thank you truly. And if this is the kind of storytelling that made you want more, consider hitting subscribe. Not because we need the numbers, but because you deserve a front row seat every time a new chapter of history unfolds. Got questions? Still curious? Drop a comment, we are right here. And trust me, what comes next will make you laugh, whisper what the hell, and question everything you thought you knew. Because history has never felt this alive.